All right. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. I wanted to talk today about two topics. One is locking down access to Azure using identity, and the other one is cost management in Azure. So from an identity point of view, Azure Active Directory is the core of Azure, and those are the identities that Azure uses, obviously, for authentication. The cost management components that we're going to talk about, it's interesting what Microsoft is doing in that space, and particularly I want to focus on cost optimization more than the other bits, but there are three components there that I really want to talk about that I think are pretty valuable in terms of what Microsoft is doing and the direction that they're heading in. All right. So our agenda today, there are two bits around Azure Identity: minimizing your blast radius and stopping people from managing local accounts. And there's some reasons why we do those things or want to do those things and have the capability to. That's of value to us. And then I want to talk about cost management, strategy and cost visibility, and cost accountability, which then sets us up for cost optimization. And as boring as cost optimization sounds, it's actually very interesting in terms of how Microsoft are approaching it, some of the things that they're introducing in that space. So the original presentation for locking down access to Azure Identity is taken from Arturo Lucatero. I'll probably pronounce that very incorrectly. I apologize, Arturo. If you're looking for the session online on the top right corner, that's the session code. So you can go to all of the recordings from Ignite and search on that and any related recordings around identity if you're interested. So let's kick off and talk about minimizing your blast radius and what we're talking about when we talk about blast radius. So basically, firstly, if you take advantages of the features in Azure AD, they can help you do what's up there. They can help you minimize the amount of access. They can minimize the impact of incidents and accidents from impacting the organization. That's the message here. That's the goal. In two ways that happens. You minimize the amount of access that people have. So if an account is breached or someone does something, it minimizes the impact of that. And you minimize the handling of credentials. So the more you have to put a password in, the more chances you have of people, either writing it down or putting it into a place where you don't want them to put it into, like phishing attempts and things like that, right? Why is this important? Because every time we have an incident or an accident, it costs time, it costs money to recover from that. So that's why it's incredibly important when we're talking about identity in Azure. So the 4 points that Microsoft have in this approach up there, we've already talked about the first one in other sessions. We've already talked a lot about multi-factor authentication. I'm not a coder, so the bit there where the original presentation had a section on removing credentials with code, managed code, so I'm going to skip that one today. And we're going to focus on the middle two. So minimizing the blast radius and stop managing VMs in Azure without local admin accounts or local accounts. So the concept here from a role-based point of view is to provide people with the permissions that they need to do the things they need to do. And that's the fundamental concept of what RBAC is, right? Role-based access control. People should be familiar with this concept, I guess, already. So it's a method to create a role based on a security principle. All the three bits that make up that role are a security principle. The role features itself, so the things that you can do, and then the scope of that. So where you can do that. So those are the three fundamental bits that make up role-based access control. And inheritance plays a part in this as well. As in Active Directory, you assign something at a top level, those permissions flow down. So same concept here with Azure and with role-based access control. So a little bit deeper on what a role is. It's a collection of actions within Azure. So there's some examples on the screen there. So if you look at virtual machines, there's like everything under virtual machines, or I can do the start action, or I can just read network information about a virtual machine. So those actions form a role, and then you've got the fundamental roles within Azure as to what you can do. So the concept of being an owner, which means you have full access. A contributor means you can read and modify. And a reader just means, obviously, you can just read the information. And there's this new role, which is the user access administrator, which just means I don't have any permissions to do anything else except modify user access. So that's the role. There are 70 built-in roles for RBAC already in Azure. So hopefully those roles there will meet the needs of what people need to do or assign for your organization. But you've still got the capability to build your own custom roles if you have something really specific. So what is a blast radius when we talk about it in terms of identity? So we talked about the combination, or it is a combination of what we talked about before, which was scope of your permissions versus the actions available to your role. Sorry, the scope of the resources versus the actions of what you can do as part of your role. So as an example, if I have a person who has a resource-specific or custom role at the resource group level, then they can do everything beneath that. So they have permissions to do everything in that resource group, or sorry, those custom role permissions, I should say, within that resource group. If I have someone who is the owner at the subscription level, then basically they have permissions to do everything from that subscription level down right to the resources. So if that gets compromised, then you have access to everything. So that's the concept of a blast radius. When you translate that to kind of what people do, so in the permission structure that Azure has. So at that subscription level, you have readers, subscription and resource groups. You have people who need to view information but not necessarily change that information. So observers, the people who do real work. I like that statement. But where you have custom roles or you have contributor roles, people who need to modify things within the Azure resources or subscription, and they do that in their day-to-day work. Then we have down at the resource level where you have a single purpose, or a robot. If you need to give someone permission to a specific component of a virtual machine or a virtual machine that's a resource, and generally Microsoft's guidance on this is that, as they're saying there, if you have something that needs to be automated or do debug, or you need someone to do debug, that's where you assign that permission at the resource level, but you wouldn't do that normally. And then on the top right, you've got the owner role, and that should be treated like we do with domain administrator accounts today. You shouldn't be logging in with that account. That account should be like a break the glass account because it's got permissions to everything. And the more you use those credentials, like we talked about before, the more risk you have of those credentials leaking or someone gaining access to those credentials. So when we talk about, I guess, the answer to that and to the issues surrounding people having elevated permissions always, or in a situation where you have that high blast radius, we want to reduce that blast radius for incidents or accidents. How do we do that? And Azure AD Privileged Identity Management is the solution around that, Microsoft's approach. And the whole purpose of AD Privileged Identity Management, Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, is you want just-in-time access. So I'm not an administrator all the time in Azure. When I need access, though, I need to be able to get access in a timely manner. And that's not necessarily just as, that top statement says, I don't always need a hammer, but sometimes it comes in handy. Today or tomorrow someone might come to you and say, I need that owner-level permission. It may not always be that, but how do you do that in a way that means you don't manually give them those permissions, forget to remove those permissions when they've done what they need to do? So you need a solution that fits or provides what we have up here on the screen. That concept of just-in-time, temporary access, something that automatically revokes, is audited, has some approvals in there. You don't necessarily want someone to just go in and say, I need administrative access done, but if you don't have visibility or you don't have an approval workflow for that, you might, those might be compliance requirements that you do have. So what does that look like? And how does privileged identity management work? So let's flick across to Microsoft Azure. There we go. And I've lost my mouse. Here we have it. Good. So the user I'm logged into Azure, the Azure portal at the moment, is an owner of the subscription. Hopefully you can read that. I might just maximize that. There we go. And basically, I've got a user here called Jane, and when I flick across to Jane's console, you can see Jane can't see any resources. Jane is a user of Azure. If she logs into the Azure portal, this is what she sees. She doesn't actually have any permissions to any resources at the moment. So can't see any virtual machines, can't see any other resources. So Jane says, I need access to go ahead and do some virtual machine work. And I've already gone through and pre-created a rule that allows Jane to do that. So if I click on my roles, and what we're going to see here is Azure AD roles and Azure resource roles. I'm going to flick down to Azure resource roles because there's one here that really fits what Jane needs to do. And Jane is going to say, okay, I want to activate my virtual machine access role, contributor role. And I've said, okay, a maximum duration for that is going to be 8 hours, and I need a reason. Please, no. Whoa, okay. Before we do that, I've actually said that Jane needs to verify her identity, so we can add multi-factor authentication on top of that. So Jane's going to log in, verify her identity through MFA. As soon as we get the MFA code. There we go. So we're using MFA on top of that to increase the security, because this is something Jane's going to get owner or contributor access to this VM. Or if you're giving someone owner access to a subscription, you'd want to give them, or you'd want to require multi-factor authentication in that authentication process. So now I can put in my reason here. You know, and Jane is good at what she does. You know, promise not to break the VM. All right, now I'll go ahead and activate that. So that's going to take a minute or two. I've seen some varied results. This is still in preview, so the dashboard hasn't updated straight away. I'll see if I refresh that. Has that come back? Dashboard sometimes takes a few minutes. Okay, so while we're waiting for that, I'll just flick back, and I wanted to show you from a management point of view what that looks like. So I'll flick back to the owner of the subscription. And if I go into, whoops, sorry, let me flick back there. If I go back in here and show you, we manage Azure resources, and in my free trial subscription here, what I can do is see what I've granted people. So this is the auditing component of that. So I can very easily see who has been given eligibility for this, how many people have eligible assignments, how many are active, and then I can drill down on that. So I can see, okay, for virtual machine user login, what does that look like? Jane's got access. I can see, I can remove that. I can update that access. And I can also modify those role settings. So if I didn't want MFA for that specific role, I've got a bunch of roles there, a bunch of options there, I should say, for that role, what my maximum duration is, what the maximum eligibility is. So if I know someone's coming in on a 3-month contract, I can say they're going to be eligible for 3 months to promote their access at any time they need to. I'm going to give them a maximum active time versus eligible time. So when they click active and they get the permissions, it's going to last for 8 hours or whatever they say they require, or whatever the maximum I give them is, and then it's going to revoke that and revert them back to a standard user. So I've got a bunch of options around that. You can see there's the approvers down the bottom there. So I can create an approval list so that if someone needs to approve that, they'll get a notification. They'll say, yep, I approve Jane to go ahead and have that access, and then we have a workflow to enable that when you need that approval process. All right, so let's flick back. Let's do a refresh of the dashboard. Let's see if Jane It's not playing. It's not playing for me today. This is always the way, isn't it? You do a demo, and you prep for it, and it works beautifully. I may have missed the other role there for Jane, which was we did virtual machine contributor. Did I do virtual machine login? Let me just check that. All right, we'll activate that. I'll go ahead and activate that role. I'll just try and we've already, yeah, okay, so we've already got that. Okay, so for whatever reason, that's not refreshing. So Jane should actually have access to all of those things she needs to. Yeah, no, it should show up on that main dashboard. So there's no virtual machines showing up there. Never mind, the demo gods are against me today. But that's the way that privileged identity management works. It may just be that they're having a problem with the preview right now, and I'm out of luck, or it's just taking a couple of minutes. It is what it is. Anyway, so I'll flick back to the presentation. And what I wanted to talk about now was how to stop managing local accounts for VMs. So I've got a demo for this as well. So I'm saying this with a smile on my face. Let's hope that one works, because it's kind of tied in there. So what are the challenges, and why is this an issue? If anyone who's worked with Windows machines, we know why, or we have, I can ask a question, I guess. Why do we have a local administrator account on domain joined machines? Why is that there? Exactly. So if we lose access to the domain, what do? We can't get to that machine. We need a way to log in locally. That's a problem though, right? It presents a problem because we need to share that with people who need access to that machine. If someone leaves an organization, you've got to go ahead and remove, well, you can't necessarily remove that account. You need to modify the password when someone leaves who had that password. Often you have a generic password across multiple machines to make it easier to manage. Otherwise, if you're managing a large fleet of machines and you have an individual password for each of those machines, then you've got to figure out a way to go and change all of those machines to new individual passwords. It becomes a big management task, right? All of the regular credential management problems exist. So Microsoft have introduced this concept of Azure AD sign-in for Azure VMs. If you think logically about why we have that account, Microsoft have thought about that, why you have that local administrator account. Same reason in Azure VMs. If you lose access for whatever reason, you need a way to get onto that machine. So there are some extensions, and I'll hopefully show you this on a Linux virtual machine, that allow you to inject permissions back in. So if you have the permissions in an Azure subscription for that virtual machine, I can go ahead, and I've actually done this. I lost the password or broke the password on a Linux VM in my Azure environment, and I went through and used the Azure permissions to reset a local machine credential so that I could gain access to this machine. So there is a way to do that, even if you don't have, or you remove, or don't share that local admin account. Yeah, if I forcibly reset a password, how does that... that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that one yet. Encrypted file system in Linux or the encrypted file system in Windows? Yeah, I don't know about how the encrypted file system in Linux works, but in Windows, if the user ID changes, you'd have to have like you have a certificate that, in theory, good practice, you should have exported when you set up that encryption, so that you can then gain access to that if that user account is disabled or removed. You use that certificate to gain access on a Windows file system to the encrypted file system. On Linux, I don't know the answer to that. Yep. Yep. Okay. Yep. But yeah, so I don't know what Microsoft's approach to that will be, or whether they're just saying encrypt at the VM level. But I understand why encrypting at the file system might be important as well for people. So the reason that we have Azure AD sign in for Azure VMs, those two reasons: improved security and seamless collaboration. So when we talk about improved security, you no longer require those local accounts. Using Azure AD credentials, so you know that when you assign the role in Azure AD, that's the permissions that people have to that machine. You're not sharing that local administrator password. And the seamless collaboration parts there, you no longer need to scrub VMs to remove accounts and keys. You no longer need to remove users manually from the VM. So once, if you've assigned local permissions, there are those considerations about encrypted file system that Drew raised, but you've got that capability of saying this identity is disabled, and so as a result, that identity can no longer gain access to those virtual machines. So that's the approach, and the preview is available for Linux VMs today. So let's see what that looks like. So if I flick back across to Azure. Come on, Jane. No, this is still John. This is John. Let's flick across. Come on, Jane. Do you have access? No. I saw it earlier on. I had to log out, log back in to get some of that info. And it's still not showing. So it could just be a cookie-related issue in the preview. Anyway. So I've got an Ubuntu VM here, and I'm going to SSH across to that. So let's hope in the back end it's worked and it's just not displaying in the Azure portal. Okay. So let me flick across to PuTTY, and I'll bring this across to this screen so you can see that. And I'm going to SSH to the IP address of my Linux VM. Oops, and let's flick back across to my main screen. Let me bring that across so you can see that. Okay, so I'm going to log in as Jane, and don't ask me. Whoops, we got caps on there. Don't ask me about the URL. Yep, don't ask. All right, let's hope I got that right, because it's all right. So I log in. What it does is it says, okay, because the SSH client doesn't have a way to bring an Azure AD authentication window up, right? Because I'm operating outside of that framework. So it tells me I need to go to a URL here, which is this service login URL. I'm going to open that URL, and it tells me to enter a code. So let me flick back across to that, and this is the code I need to enter. So we enter that code there. All right, continue my authentication. Right, so it says, okay, that's fine. This is where the authentication request is coming from. It's Jane, so it's recognized that it's Jane Smith, and I need to enter Jane Smith's password. And it says, okay, you signed into the Azure virtual machine. So go ahead and you can close that window if you want and go back. Now that we've done that on my Linux virtual machine, I hit enter, and I'm logged onto that virtual machine. So that's a user that I set up no local permissions for Linux on that virtual machine. So Jane is a contributor. She can go ahead and do whatever operations she needs to on that Linux VM. So that's pretty cool. That's a great way of giving access to some of those VM requirements, VM access requirements. Does it give us sudo rights? If I'm a contributor, yes. If I'm a VM reader, no. So let me flick back across to my presentation. So that's all I really wanted to talk about from an identity point of view. The preview is available today for Linux VMs. Server 2019, Windows 10 is coming, but it's not there just yet. And I wanted to change gears now and talk about making the most of Azure by optimizing cloud spend. And I'm going to try and make this as interesting as possible. Okay? It might sound like it's a boring topic. The original presentation was from Joanna Van Gansen, who's a group program manager. There's the ID in the top right if you want to view the entire presentation. She goes into it in a lot more detail than I'm going to go into today. There's some stuff that's only available through enterprise agreements. I can't actually show you a lot of live demos today, unfortunately, but I can show you kind of what Microsoft's approach is, and I've got a couple of screen caps that kind of show some of that information.
So to get us started with strategy and cost visibility, we're going to check in with Brad Wright from Microsoft.
Hello, I'm Brad Wright. I'm a software engineering leader here at Microsoft and currently run the engineering for all of our financial systems at the company except for our SAP implementation. Previous to this, I had a job of moving all of Microsoft's infrastructure to the cloud. We were making progress, but not fast enough. And so the CIO at the time asked me to take on this job to run the finance and engineering portfolio because he figured if the cloud guy could move the toughest portfolio to the cloud, no one else would have an excuse. Over the last couple of years, we've made amazing progress. For the finance portfolio, I have everything but 2 systems in the cloud, and all up, we're over 90%. However, we discovered that many of our old habits and behaviors were creating new problems for us in the cloud. What we really discovered is that we had a bunch of teenagers working for us. They leave the water running, they leave the lights on, there's an old pizza box under the bed. I'll give you an example. The other day we did a scan of one of our subscriptions. We found 32 terabytes of unattached storage just floating in space that hadn't been cleaned up. Some of it as old as 5 and 6 years old, thus the pizza box. Another example, I came in one morning, brought up a report I was looking at and noticed 5 P11 SQL databases running in a subscription. Those are really expensive databases and they were sitting here empty. So I asked the team, what's going on? And they said, we're getting ready for deployment. I'm like, great, when's the deployment? They said in 2 weeks. So I had to ask the question. I went ahead and asked it, so how difficult was it to set up those databases? And they said, oh, it was really easy, just took a few minutes. And it was at that moment that I understood what an aneurysm felt like. So here I had a team burning $30,000 worth of Azure compute for no good reason. So we realized very quickly we needed to change our behaviors. Also, some of our past decisions were haunting us as well. Certain policies put in place 20 years ago were creating situations where engineers had to select SKUs that were way more expensive than they needed. Also, the habit that engineers had gotten in a capital expenditure world where you provision for peak plus 30%, you order the hardware away in advance, get it deployed, and let it sit there, and then eventually make use of it. All those habits were coming into play and running up very large Azure bills, making it very difficult for us to operate. So we really needed to fundamentally change our culture. It wasn't a technology, it was a behavior. What are they watching? What are they looking at? What are they trying to optimize for? How do they plan? We need to bring a whole new set of tools to bear so that they can actually see these and we could bake it into the culture. What you're going to see here in this session here at Ignite is some of those tools that came out of the Azure team to help us with this. Because the other job I have, as well as those 2 that I already described, is also helping the Azure team understand what engineering teams at large companies need, such as my team.
One slide too far, that's not too bad. Oh. Okay, so this, what has Microsoft learned from this? So the whole purpose of that was to show you that they looked at this, what they were doing at scale. They'd also looked at what other companies were doing at scale to deal with that issue of changing to the cloud. What they found was that, and what we heard there is cost management wasn't any one person's or a technical issue. It was a cultural change to how people worked within that cloud environment. And cost management isn't an individual contribution, so it's kind of like a team sport. You've got management that needs to be involved, finance that needs to be involved, and app teams or developers or whoever those teams are that are working on that need to get on board. And that's a challenge in itself. And it can go really badly if you're implementing a cloud strategy or using cloud or migrating to cloud and you don't have that approach. You know, cost can get out of hand. So what is there to help with that? So firstly, you need to gain visibility of what's actually going on in a cloud environment. If you don't know what's going on, how can you address it or change behavior or do anything with that? So that's an important part of it. Then you need to get a broader set of understanding about what people's key goals are and then how you attribute accountability to those goals so that you can make people accountable for what they're doing based on what their goals are. And then an optimization aspect of that is to then say, okay, are we using resources in Azure in the best way that we can? Are there things that we can do to do this better? So, and Brad talked about that when he was talking about, spinning workloads up, if it's really easy to do 5 minutes beforehand as opposed to 2 weeks beforehand, before you needed something. And even there's some stuff, I probably won't show the other video, but examples of creating servers in code to help you with optimization, so that an example of that is if a company at Microsoft needed to run a testing process. And what they do is they do that all in code. So they spin up the virtual machines, they inject the data into that, they run the tests, they export the data out, and then they blow away that virtual machine environment. So they do it completely on demand rather than have something that's sitting there 24 by 7 consuming. So those are the kind of optimization things. And transition to cloud, and that was a really detailed example, probably a little bit too early. But the transition to cloud requires a different mindset and approach to what we've traditionally had when we had on-premises hardware or inflexible workloads. So the tools available right now to help with this, there are a bunch that are already there. There's the enterprise portal through enterprise agreements. There's the Cloud-In solution, which Microsoft acquired, but that's a paid solution. It can manage multiple clouds. The Azure Advisor is there to help you with recommendations. There's Azure Reservations. Talk about those in a few minutes if you haven't heard about them. And it's the same with Azure Hybrid Benefits. So these are the things that are there. But what Microsoft realized was these were all separate tools. And what they wanted to do was to bring that all together into this one console. So we're seeing a lot of this at Microsoft. I think in 3 of the 5 Lunch and Learn presentations, maybe more, I've talked about that concept of this consolidation of information into a more meaningful and efficient use. So the cost management console is a way to bring that together and give us more capability, not just the capability of all those other portals or solutions, but to give us more capability. So Microsoft found lots of people wanted to do this. Cost management is a big requirement for a lot of companies. They realized it needed to scale. Some people out there have massive environments, and they need cost management to scale. They need the data to be low latency, so reasonably quick to get updates as to what that usage looks like. You can't wait days for this, right? Because by that stage, someone could have been running that P11 database instance that's going to cost you $3,000. So the information needs to be very frequent, very up to date. So Microsoft are building this on top of the Azure environment. It's not a separate system that sits on an internal, platform somewhere. It's on Azure so that it can get that information quickly, and it's on Azure so that it can integrate with the fundamentals of Azure. So when we talked about identity access and those types of things, that's part of why Microsoft are building it on that platform as well. So there are things like, access to resources, access to resource groups that already exist within Azure, tags, those types of things, taking advantage of that management layer. So one of the fundamental things about this approach as well is that Microsoft have doubled the investment in the cost management area, so very recently. So they see the importance and are investing in that. So couple of ways to access that information. The easiest way is in the Azure portal. It's there, it's ready to use, it's easy to use for people. You can also connect in via Power BI, and there's also Azure APIs. Microsoft's approach will always be APIs first, and then those things will filter up to the Azure portal. So it's not a live demo, I realize, but if we look at some of the cost visibility, some examples of what that looks like. So when I go into a subscription and I'm looking at visibility, we're focusing on visibility at the moment, I want to see how we're tracking. I can see a spike in this graph that kind of was on an upward trend, but somewhere around August, September, we really hit a high mark there. So I want to investigate that a little bit further. So if I go and have a look at departments, I can see this AMA department. Consumption there was significantly higher than everyone else, so I can go and drill down on that, get some information about that, and I can see quite a significant peak around August, September. February, March, not a lot happening. April through July, reasonably consistent, and all of a sudden August, September, massive jump. So we kind of want to find out why is that the case. So there's another way that I can look at that information that breaks it down by those categories there, the type of service, and that's great, but it doesn't really give me much more there. So if we dig into the cost analysis side of things, it gives us the capability to do some real powerful filtering rather than just give me that high level. So in this view, we can see service name, location, enrollment account name down the bottom. We can go in and we can break that down by what it looked like for the last quarter. So a more detailed view of that. And I'm focusing and I can see an increase overall, but this doesn't really help me, right? So let's change the visualization here. So we say, give it to me by service type. And that's great. I can see, virtual machines are pretty high there, but it's still not really clear. It's a great visualization. I can see all the services that are using that cost. But when I change it to a line graph, then I can really get a clear indication of what service, in this case that blue line, that everything else is pretty consistent, apart, there's that purple line there as well, which looks like Azure SQL database or no storage. But you can see that blue line Windows virtual machines jumped up right around that period that I'm interested in. So if I drill down onto that resource or I categorize that by resource group, everyone else is fairly consistent and flat, except I can see from that blue line that this is a jumper resource group. So now I've targeted a resource group. The resource group, should have a group of people or a department or someone that has access to that. I can go talk to them and I can say, what is it, what is the spike? But I want to go armed with a bit more information. So we can drill even deeper than that and say, what are the services that cause that? So I can see in August that someone spun up 2 virtual machines, a D15 V2 and an F7 2S V2, and that's what's driven my cost right up. So I can go to that group and I can say, guys, I can take some action. Why do we need these virtual machines? Do we need them 24/7? All those other things we heard about. So I've got great visibility now to really target what is driving or consuming cost in Azure. This slide I wanted to show you because Amazon Web Services is expensive. No, that's not the reason. It is, look, it's 78,000 versus 46,000 for Azure. Anyway, the point is that Microsoft's approach from this portal, from the cost analysis and cost management, is not to focus on Azure only. So they've got the capability and they're building in the capability to look at other portals, recognizing that there are other cloud services out there that you might want to manage through one portal and not have to go to another portal to manage. So that's a little bit about cost visibility. I wanted to talk now about cost accountability. So now that we have better visibility, you want accountability from people. So, how do we drive cost optimization? How do we drive that the cost down, or how do we maintain our costs or our budgets within Azure without having those spikes? How do we make people accountable for the services they're running, rather than just assuming it's a blank check to be able to run up resources in Azure? And there are some additional features in Azure. There's this concept of management groups. There's integration with role-based access control and tagging. So tagging is an important one where people want to customize information about resources. So an example of that is a resource group in Azure is just a grouping of resources. But if I give permissions to, say, a test team or a web team or some team to that resource group, I might want all the resources in that resource group to have a specific tag like a cost center, so that when I'm looking at my costing, I can say, okay, well, this is the cost center that incurred all of that billing. So it's meaningful to my organization or to finance, rather than just being some resource group name that doesn't make sense. So what Microsoft have done to try and match this to organizational structure requirements is to introduce this concept of management groups. So the management group concept is there to map to an organizational hierarchy. So rather than the organization having to try to understand what Azure looks like, it's kind of the other way around. You get this custom management. Now, this is available, and you see multiple subscriptions here, and you might say, well, who has multiple subscriptions? And I can almost guarantee, apart from some of the test subscriptions or test Azure environments, that you will have multiple subscriptions in small companies. Jasco is a small company, yet we have at least 7 subscriptions in our Azure environment. It's just the nature of how Azure works. So you can map your subscriptions to these management groups, create a custom hierarchy so it makes sense to you. And we can do things, like I said, you can apply role-based access control to those management groups, and you can assign tags to those groups. The importance of that is when we look at RBAC. So the standard permissions around Azure are the reader, the contributor, and the owner. But you may want someone who's affiliated with cost management not to actually have access to the information. You only want them to have access to the costing information. So Microsoft have introduced the cost management controls there. So you can have a cost management reader who can only see billing information and might be only associated to a specific management group, not across the entire organization, or a contributor who can set budgets and set rules and things like that, or a billing reader who's got read-only access to, say, the billing information, which is a little bit different to the costing in Azure. But you can also use those standard roles as well. The tags are there for cost analysis, and this is important so that you can assign your custom information into that hierarchy. And I mentioned the cost center example. The interesting thing is you can apply policies. So in Azure, when I'm configuring a management group and I can configure a policy for that management group that says every time someone creates a resource in that management group, they need to assign a custom tag. Now I can predefine those custom tags, and I can have one set as default. So that for the resource group or the dev team, that dev management hierarchy, every time they create a resource in that group, they don't need to go and manually select or type something in. The default might be dev. If they want to change it, I might give them the opportunity to change it to something like test or whatever other category or whatever other cost center they want to apply for that resource, but the default will be dev. And that helps me make sure that I have those tags on everything that's created, not as, I'm not capturing some of the information. I need to get all of the information for my cost review or analysis to be accurate. So the concept there is then to assign budgets to that management hierarchy. And the point there is so that people can monitor use using the budgets. You can see that budget for that management group is set at a certain amount. You can see how you're traveling based on that. And you can also set up some notifications when thresholds are met, 25%, 50%, 90%, whatever you want. And you can also do some automation actions. So you might say, my budget could cover multiple resource groups. So we've got a dev, and we've got a test, and we've got a prod. So you might say, if we hit 90%, automatically turn off all dev. That type of capability is there to automate something that you have control over to make sure you don't go over your budget. And that's integrated into that whole cost analysis thing. So again, not a live demo, but an example of some of the policies here. So the one I talked about, standard tags should be applied. Whatever policy that you have in place for resources in Azure, those policies you can then say, I want to apply that to a management group, and then that shows up in the budgeting in cost analysis. And then you can see here the example is there's a monthly and there's a quarterly and there's a yearly budget view, and I can see how I'm tracking based on that. It might be important from a finance point of view if you're used to traditional, that yearly forecasting. And if I click on that, then that's where I can see the information about what my rules are for that. So webhooks, SMS, email messages, automated tasks within Azure to take some action on that. So it's pretty comprehensive from that point of view. From a roadmap point of view, so we're in 2018. Microsoft's approach, and visualized at the bottom there, is that cost management is going to be the way that things, where things happen, I should say, moving forward. So Q4 2018 is where we should see some additional capability. Right now it's only available for enterprise agreements, but we'll see this across all pay-as-you-go agreements, and Microsoft are committed to making this available for CSP agreements as well, which will be an interesting one. because that's something that, CSP is traditionally, the billing in that was made available through whoever the CSP, the cloud solutions provider is. So if Telstra was your cloud solutions provider, they should have provided you with some sort of cost visibility, right? So Microsoft are going to, see in 2019 Azure CSP support. So Microsoft are going to include that in that cost management in the portal. So, okay, the bit that popped up there on the bottom right is that this is free for Azure. So obviously, when Microsoft are coding to get information out of Amazon Web Services, there'll be a cost associated with doing that. They're saying this is going to be free for Azure. All this capability will be free for Azure. They want you to use Azure, obviously. But there's going to be a cost associated if you want to use the cost features through for another cloud, which is kind of what you see today anyway, right? So there's a company called RightScale that does some very comprehensive cloud management across multiple clouds, but you have to pay for that product because you pay for the capability and you pay for that integration in the one console to do all of that sort of stuff. So let's talk about cost optimization. So this is the bit that I like, and a couple of people in the projects team will have already seen this slide, and it's a great visualization of cost optimization. So, in this scenario, we have a workload which is in orange. We have 3 VM sizes. So which VM is this workload going to run in comfortably? The answer is all 3, right? Which one will the developer want? The developer's going to want VM1. Why? Because we've told the developers of applications that we want reliability, we want performance. So they're going to go, okay, I'm used to working with providing 30% overhead on CPU and memory so that if we have a burst, we can deal with that. That's what my KPIs are based on for the reliability and performance of my application, so I'm going to choose a nice big VM. Whereas the business is going to say, I really want VM3. It still gives me some overhead, but it's going to cost me a heck of a lot less, right? So that's kind of that approach. So how do you tell people to save money? How do you get across to people you don't need that? VM1, you can go with VM3. So Microsoft have taken on into that cost portal the capability for two key areas. There are more that they're focusing on, and I'll show you that in a second in our demo. But the 2 big ones are resource recommendations. So to say, do you have machines that are idle, doing nothing? So they will, run their analysis on virtual machines that are sitting there doing nothing and saying, maybe you want to turn that off. Or if you use it irregularly, maybe you want to, only turn it on when you need it to do something. Or if it's not doing much, but it's an important thing that needs to run 24/7, then maybe you can reduce the sizing of that virtual machine, so you're going to pay a lot less for it. That's what resource recommendations are about. Purchasing recommendations are reserved instances. And I think I jumped ahead of myself because reserved instances, if you haven't heard of reserved instances, basically the capability there is to say, I need a virtual machine for a 1-year period or a 3-year period, and you commit to having that virtual machine running for that period of time. So if you cancel the virtual machine before that time, obviously there's a penalty there because you're committed to Microsoft for that period. But the result is that Microsoft has said, okay, you're committing to that, I'm going to give you a reduction in cost. So you're going to pay a lot less for that virtual machine because you're committing to a year. You're not using the dynamic capability of Azure for that virtual machine. You don't need any of the automation bits to turn it off and turn it on when you need to. You're not using it for server code. You're going to run it 24/7 for a year. We'll give you a big discount for that. We like commitment. That's what they're saying. And it's not just VMs as well. So just important to point out, at the moment, VMs, SQL databases, Cosmos DB, SUSE Enterprise Linux as well. And the other bit is the Azure hybrid benefit, where people are probably familiar with this already. It's been out for a while, but the hybrid use benefit is if I have software assurance on my server licensing, then I have the capability to use those licensings. I have the entitlement to use the licenses within Azure and reduce the cost of the Windows license when I'm deploying a Windows VM. And there are some pretty significant savings that you can get out of using the hybrid use benefit. The examples here are kind of like the most extreme examples. It varies based on the workload. and obviously the term of if you're using reserved instances in conjunction with hybrid use benefits. So if we go quickly and have a look at cost optimization, I don't have access to the portal that I want to show you, but oops, I flipped across to the wrong screen. So right now this is available. I just wanted to show you what it looks like in the advisor recommendations. This is kind of what will be in that cost analysis, but you'll be able to do these things from the cost analysis console. So it will have recommendations listed in there, and I'll show you that in a second. So I think in my demo environment, I had a VM running for a couple of days, doing absolutely nothing. I was hoping that it would show up as in a recommendation, but it's not. So that's a shame. Never mind. So the other things that advisor cost recommendations will do, the optimization you see on the screen there, if you have unprovisioned express route circuits, so links from networks into Azure, they'll say when you're not using that, do you still need it? Idle virtual network gateways, so if you have VPNs that are doing nothing, or express route gateways that are doing nothing, or links between different Azure networks that are doing nothing, they'll tell you that. They'll suggest you buy reserved instances in the case where it's applicable. So those are the types of things that that you can do. And it kind of looks like, this is my backup slide because I didn't have the info in the console to show you, and it's a bit blurry, but the concept here within advisor recommendations, you can see it suggests you go and buy a virtual machine reserved instance. There's 15 virtual machines in this case, and it's going to say annually, by doing that, you're going to save $26,000 for those 15 VMs. There must be pretty big VMs in this case. Or you can right-size those virtual machines, and this is our estimated cost as to what that is going to save you per year by just right-sizing. So it's a good way of saying, okay, here's the information that Azure Analytics has run over that. Can I go ahead and do that to save money? So a good way of surfacing that up without you having to go and look at individual virtual machine utilization. So once it highlights something, you might want to go and drill a bit deeper and validate that information. Right-sizing, just be aware that when you resize a virtual machine in Azure, it is an impacting process. I can say this VM had 2 CPUs and 4 gig of memory. It was whatever size it was, and now I'm giving it a new size, and it's 1 virtual CPU and 2 gig of memory. And all of the data will be retained, but that's a process that has to turn off the virtual machine, just reassign the virtual machine specs for CPU and memory, and then bring that virtual machine back online. So it's a seamless process, but seamless from the point of view of the virtual machine looks exactly like it did before, but you do have to take it offline to make that change. The virtual machine data, I should have said, looks exactly like it was before, not the virtual machine config. That's what we're changing. So now we've gone through that process. We've gone through our whole cost analysis, accountability, and optimization, and we're saving money for the business, and everyone in the business loves you, and they're coming to you and they're saying, fantastic, you've done a great job, you saved me a lot of money. So what do? Reinvest in the bits that make sense. If modernizing applications, you're not a developing house, then you might not do that, but you can then start to invest in, my favorite area, security and management, right? If you're managing the environment well, saving money where you need to save money gives you that flexibility to say, okay, we've done that, we're below our budgets, let's invest somewhere else that makes sense to us, or is of more value to us. That's the whole purpose here. I was going to say let's check back in with Brad, but I'll skip that, and let me just flick past that slide. And all that he's saying is that basically, what they found was a change in culture. When people had visibility to that information within Azure in cost analysis internally, when they had accountability, so they had to, someone in a finance position could say, you're going to blow your budget if you keep going the way you're going, or why did you spin up these $30,000 worth of virtual machines a month, these databases instances where you only need them for a short period of time, and you can spin them up even a day before you need them, rather than 2 weeks before you need them. So there was that change in culture. People actually did start to change the way they were doing things. which was pretty interesting. And they also started doing a lot more. So they saw the capability in Azure, and instead of just using virtual machines, they started using Azure. I'm looking at Alan to prompt me. I've forgotten the term they use. Wait. where instead of using use a kind of like a service. Microsoft have a name for that, and the name escapes me right now. Use a service instead of a virtual machine. So you use an IIS service instead of a IIS virtual machine to provide an Azure function. That's what I was thinking of, an Azure function. So people are using Azure functions instead of spinning up virtual machines, and they're doing a lot more in code when they needed to, not just in case or having it running 24/7 or even during the day when they didn't need to. So the way to get started right now, enterprise agreements only, unfortunately, and I've still been waiting. I left this session to last because I was hoping that we would have this available for pay-as-you-go, but it's not there yet. But when that's available, use that to look at the cost management and how you can do things better. So number 2, can I use reserved instances? Can I use my hybrid use benefit? Can I right-size my machines, my virtual machines that are running on SQL databases or whatever? And then reinvest whatever savings because we're utilizing the environment better. So there's a bunch more information there. We'll put this recording up on our website, but this is also available in that presentation I mentioned. So if you want the links, go to the Ignite website. I've got a URL coming up in a second, but there's a bunch more info there, and then all of the other related sessions around cost management if you're interested. So, I mean, today feels like I've focused a lot on cost, right? The impact of security accidents or incidents in an environment, that costs time and money. Improving cost with the cost analysis, cost accountability and optimization in Azure. So one of the things here, though, is that Microsoft are taking the lead in this space. So we had that period where, like in the security area that I talked about, I think 2 weeks ago, or was it last week, where Microsoft are saying, okay, we had that partner ecosystem, and there's still, to a degree, there is that partner ecosystem that might provide more capability because Microsoft are playing catch-up, so people like RightScale already have a cloud product out there right now, right? So there is still a partner option that might do more right now. But Microsoft are kind of jumping in and saying, we can't leave this out of the core of our product. This needs to be there. So we need identity and identity security to be core within the Azure platform. We need cost management to be a core part of the platform. They're not leaving it out, leaving it up to someone else. They're kind of taking that front foot and saying, this is really important. We need to be doing something about this. And of course, like if we manage, and I've said this already, if we manage things more efficiently, this gives us the capability to do more, right? To reinvest. And this is both in our best interest as service providers, and it's also in the best interest of our customers because you manage costs. No one likes bill shock. No one likes to see that this resource that we said would run for only what you use for in Azure, and we've gone and we've blown our budget on that. If that happens, people are less likely to go back to that cloud provider, right? So it's also in Microsoft's best interest to get this right so that you can manage your costs more efficiently and avoid that, okay, this month we had a massive cost, and how are we going to account for that? We didn't budget for this. So it's also in Microsoft's best interest to keep people happy on that Azure cloud platform with more predictable costs. And it's not just predictability, it's also visibility and accountability as well. And again, I think I'll just close off by saying that Microsoft is investing in making Azure that platform that can provide all of those tools. So it's a complete platform rather than saying we're going to leave some of it up to our partners or to other people to close that circle. So that's all I've got in terms of content. Thank you very much. The Ignite content for all of the presentations is available at that website. Please also see us at www.jasco.net.au, and we'll have the recordings available there soon. And we're done. That is it for Lunch and Learn. Thank you very much. I've had a lot of fun delivering these sessions. I hope some of it was valuable to people. There's a re-recording I need to do of, I think, session number 3, and I'll do that shortly. I just had a technical issue there. And I hope you've enjoyed the lunches along the way. So thank you very much, everyone. Oh, okay. Questions? Fire away. It's a newish area, so I'll do what I can. Yep. So the question is, when you say a scheduled workload? Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yep. That's. Yeah. So the question is kind of like, I want to take advantage of reserved instances because I know I'm going to need that machine for a year or for 3 years, but I know that I'm only going to need that machine between 9 to 5 for 5 days of the week. I don't want it 24/7. I don't have an answer for you on that one, unfortunately. I didn't hear an announcement at Ignite about what they're doing in that space. My advice there would be you would have to do some cost analysis between the size of that virtual machine running as a reserved instance versus me automating on a pay-as-you-go scale to shut that machine down at 6 o'clock and spin it up at 4 a.m. Monday to Friday, and then on Saturday leave it turned off. So those are the automation capabilities that might offset that, but doesn't mean that it's going to offset it enough from a cost point of view to make it more feasible to run it in that way. You might find that the reserved instance virtual machine running 24/7 is still going to be cheaper than using a pay-as-you-go with that automation in place. Yeah. Fire away. That's okay. Yep. So for reserved instances, you mean in general? Okay. The options that we have in terms of CPU, memory, and storage. Yep. That's correct. Yeah. So the question, I'll try and summarize the question. So if we're thinking about reserved instances, but we're not sure about the sizing of the virtual machine, should I start with a pay-as-you-go and then look at resizing, applying the reserved instance once I know what that looks like, or have I got the right size machine? So Microsoft actually has some flexibility when you use reserved instances. So you can do it in one of two ways. I think you can do it, it's not across subscription, but across a group of machines. So I can say, I've got a reserved instance group, so the D-series VMs. I want to start small, and I'm going to commit. That's a reserved instance. So I'm spinning it up as a D1 V2. I've got 1 CPU, 2 gig of memory. Now, I found that's not enough, so I need to, well, my cost analysis is telling me that, my recommendation is to increase that because I'm hitting the CPU hard or whatever. I'm running out of memory. So you can then, without incurring any cancellation and recreation penalties for that Azure reserved instance, because I've set all of my D series, I could change that to a D2 V4 or whatever, D2 V2, to get 2 CPUs and 4 gig of memory or whatever the requirement is. So I can do it in that way. Or there is another way where I can specify that my D1 V2 is my reserved instance, and then I go to Microsoft support and I say, I'm still committing to have this VM running, but I need to increase it. So I want to change it to a D2 V2 size, but I'm not canceling. It's the same VM. And so they will go ahead and do that in the background for you and increase the spec for that machine. So that part of it's not as fluid as it could be, but you've got two options there as to whether to do it on a individual VM case-by-case basis or whether you do it for a series of VMs. The other one that I haven't really talked about here for cost optimization is burstable VMs. That's a whole other topic in itself, and the way they work that out, it gets a little bit complex. So, cool. Hope that helps. Awesome. All right. I'm going to stop the recording there.